Welcome. If you just joined us, we're just going to wait another couple of minutes to see if more people join so that they get the full show. We'll start at 2 minutes past 3, which is actually coming up now. So according to my watch. Okay, we're going to kick off. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I'm Stephen Groosd, and I'm from the South African Institute of International Affairs, based here in Johannesburg, which is very warm today, unlike those who might be joining us from Russia, where I think it's going to be very cold. I am the head of our African Governance and Diplomacy program, and under that ambit falls the Russia-Africa work that is led by my colleague Kaylee, who you're going to hear a little bit from a little bit later. We've got a nice big audience today, which is really great.
Okay.
And sorry, somebody's not on mute.
Yeah.
So we're being joined by people all around the world, which is really great. So we thought the origins of this program came up, we launched the program in March last year, and it's a 2-year research endeavor looking at Russia's growing relationship with Africa and, of course, African countries' relations with Russia, which are also blossoming. A seminal event, of course, was the Russia-Africa Summit in Sochi in 2019, and there's been a renewed interest in this subject since then. It's also it's going to be a special edition of our South African Journal of International Affairs. There's going to be a guest edited journal looking specifically into this subject. So there's growing interest. But we found that there wasn't much commentary from Africa. A lot of it was coming from the United States or Europe or Russia itself. And what we've also found is that the world tends to divide into Russophiles and Russophobes. And we're trying to navigate that space in the middle and let the facts and the research speak for itself. This project is funded by an anonymous donor, as well as the government of Sweden, and of course the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. And I'm delighted to hand over now to Henning Zur, the resident representative of Konrad Adenauer Foundation in South Africa, joining us from a rainy Cape Town. Henning, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and welcome to everyone who is tuning in today. I think it's wonderful that we have this discussion today, because actually Russia's engagement in Africa is anything but new. Predominantly during the Cold War era, Russia was very active in Africa. Then afterwards, it was less active. But in recent years, we can observe that actually a lot of regional powers are becoming more and more engaged on the African continent. Among them, not only Russia, but also Turkey or India or United Arab Emirates. So we thought it's interesting to have a closer look to what are Russia's interests on the continent and what is also their approach, because with every regional power which is active here on the African continent also comes a different approach. I would just like to stress one thing, and that is that in any case, I think it's important that the Africans themselves make up their mind how they wish to engage with any of all those foreign powers, including the European and the US and Japan and so on, the West, how they want to engage here on this continent. And Stephen, you mentioned that quite rightly, that we need also more input from the Africans themselves, how they want to engage with all the foreign powers who are engaging here on Africa. Last but not least, I would like to thank Saya for all this research work and all the good cooperation we have throughout those years. It's always a pleasure to cooperating you. And of course, I would like to thank all the panelists who are with us here today. It's great that you are here, and I wish us a very interesting discussion.
Thank you very much, Henning. Great to hear from you. So what we have are 4 speakers today, or actually 5 speakers today, on research work that they have been doing as part of this project. Not all of the papers are out. In fact, none of the papers have actually been published yet. We were hoping that they will all get through our publications timeline from by the end of the year. We'll see if we can manage that. But everybody who will be speaking today has been working on research papers. So they'll give you a sneak preview, and we will send the links through to the list as soon as possible. It will also give us an excuse to engage with you again. So thanks very much for joining us. So the first speaker today is Samuel Ramani, who is a tutor of politics and international relations at the University of Oxford, where he received his doctorate in March of this year. His first book on Russia's foreign policy towards Africa will be published by the Oxford University Press and Hearst and Company in 2022. And Sam is going to talk about the work that he has done on comparative work between Russia and China in Africa, entitled Prospective Partners or Asymmetric Rivals. Sam, you have 15 minutes.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve, for the introduction and for getting this great session started. So my work in SIA was really looking at what synergies are present between Russian and Chinese tactics and strategies in Africa, and also how do Russia and China interact on the African continent? Because there's a growing tendency, at least in Western analytical circles, to ascribe trends and patterns in Sino-Russian engagement in Africa to trends in the broader relationship between Russia and China. So if the relationship is improving, we assume that there's going to be a similar kind of improvement in Africa, but there really isn't that much critical analysis of exactly how Russia and China are positioning themselves relative to one another on the ground. So that is a gap that I think that this paper was trying to fill. And just to give you a brief overview, obviously, since the turn of the year 2000, China and Russia have really ensconced themselves as resurgent great powers inside Africa. And you might look towards events like the 2000 China-Africa Summit as a starting point for the Chinese involvement in Africa, which is kind of a prelude or a precursor to what Russia would do 19 years later in Sochi. The starting point of the new Russian involvement in Africa really came during the era of Yevgeny Primakov as foreign minister. So he served as foreign minister and then prime minister from 1996 to 1998, and then 1998 to 1999, respectively. He brought in ideas like debt forgiveness, promotion of anti-Western norms, a desire to make Russian foreign policy in Africa untethered and somewhat more independent from the West. That was kind of what he really brought in. So the strategies of Russia and China in Africa, the contemporary strategies, have been in development at a relatively similar time. They started during the late 1990s. They've been in development for about 25 years. Obviously, there's the Cold War era that came before that. But the early 1990s was something of a period of fluctuation and strategic confusion almost for both Moscow and Beijing. That's why I kind of distinguish between the old and the new strategies with that kind of periodization at the start of the paper. During the 1960s to 1980s, it appeared as if the Soviet Union were asymmetric rivals. And that is the second part of my title here. To what extent does that asymmetric rivalry persist? The current Sino-Russian relationship is more cordial, but there's a relatively limited strategic engagement. There's a lot of agreements on normative issues and combating unilateral sanctions, some very selective dialogue on the economic and security sphere, but not much on how to mitigate regional conflicts, not much strategic coordination and engagement. So I would argue that the Russian and Chinese relationship in Africa today is not a repetition of the asymmetric rivalry that we saw during the Cold War in rote form, though some elements of that are persistent, especially in the commercial sphere. But it also falls short of the level of being a prospective partner, which is the other option that I gave in the title. And that would be what one might expect would be coming from their strengthening bilateral relationship, that it'd be going in that direction. So it's somewhere in between where they engage selectively and they have a cordial relationship, but they don't necessarily cooperate. So there's this cordial relationships, but strategic non-cooperation. That's my overall bird's eye perspective of where I see the Sino-Russian engagement inside Africa. So to give a very brief overview of some of the tactics and strategies that the two countries are employing inside Africa. Well, obviously, China's approach to Africa tends to emphasize win-win projects and tends to win-win development and highlights the basically synergizing the Belt and Road Initiative with development initiatives that we're seeing coming from the continent, like the African Union's Agenda 2063. And that importance has been made clear by Xi Jinping's June 2019 remarks at the Osaka summit, where he talked about that synergy and talked about that development. So the lingo and the buzzwords are really inclusive growth, sustainable development, and win-win projects. That seems to be what China is trying to promote inside Africa. And China is pursuing those objectives, at least officially, in a variety of sectors in a variety of spheres. So in the mining sector, for example, China has exploded as an important power. In 2005, they had 0.4% of the share of the mineral resources. Now, by 2018, that had risen to 7% in terms of investment. They're relying a little bit less on African oil, but for example, because they've divested more towards the Middle East, so there's less reliance on supply from Angola, Nigeria, and other countries. But the Chinese National Petroleum Company has long-term contracts in Nigeria. Unipec has got contracts in Gabon. They've got in-depth in those areas too. So a lot of presence in the mining sector, a lot of presence in the energy sector. So extractives are still important, but they frame those extractives in a way that, their investments in those sectors are contributing to their development. So it's not wholly like another incarnation of neocolonialism. They also are heavily involved in mega projects inside Africa in the economic sphere. So like whether that be hydroelectricity plants, the modernization of the Suez Canal Economic Zone, oil refinery constructions, and building government buildings like the African Union and the ECOWAS headquarters. And they provide lines of credit towards infrastructure projects. So Africa has about $100 billion in latent investments in infrastructure projects as of 2018. 25.7 billion of those really came, at least in part or largely, from Chinese sources, like the largest double-track railway in West Africa coming through Nigeria, or the standard gauge railway in Tanzania, or the digital Silk Road projects that we're seeing popping up all across the continent. Those are things that China is getting involved in. So China's involvement in Africa is economic heavy, and it really relies on a lot of those buzzwords and a lot of those sectors. They are getting a little more involved in the security sphere. They've advanced their own model of peace building, especially in Liberia in 2003. And they're arguing that the best way to cure the chronic problems of fragile states in Africa is through a model of developmental peace. Invest in development and stability will follow. And that's what they advanced first in Liberia and then more recently in areas like Sudan and South Sudan. However, China has been very restrained in terms of engaging in diplomacy or getting into the weeds of these regional conflicts. We're seeing that with historically in Darfur and the Ethiopia-Eritrea conflict, and most recently by their calls for non-interference in the imbroglio that's unfolding right now in Tigray. So that's the one exception was when they chaired meetings between rival South Sudanese factions and they got involved with IGAD, but that seems to be more of an exception rather than the norm. They are also getting involved in training of elites, in particular. So some people are accusing them of trying to spread their governance model of the Chinese Communist Party with training workshops and seminars for party cadres. Others are looking at this more as a way of kind of just building goodwill with the official communities in African states. So that's a bit controversial and that's a bit of a split screen. But they're definitely getting involved in that. And they're also getting involved in professional military education. Like if you look at the foreign students in their military institutes, 60% of them in China originate from Africa. And military academies are popping up all across the continent, like the Oliver Tambo one in Uganda that looks a lot like China or even directly funded by their Chinese counterparts. However, there's obviously some sources of criticism and all this win-win projects may not look exactly the way that they are in real life. I mean, there's mounting debt that African countries have. There's concerns about that debt having implications for national sovereignty. There's debt repayment disputes that are happening on a regular basis. And there's a feeling that countries are investing in China, not because they really want China as their first choice partner, but because the Americans are so disengaged, there really is not much prospect of engagement with the Americans. So those are some drawbacks and weaknesses, But that's the bird's eye picture very briefly of what China is doing in Africa. What Russia's doing in Africa is actually got some similar characteristics, but also some very different ones. They're going top heavy into the mining sector, particularly platinum, gold, and diamonds. And they're investing quite heavily in Southern African projects, like what we're seeing with Alrosa, the diamond company in Angola, or Darwindale and platinum in Zimbabwe. They're investing a lot into energy. So whereas China has been doing a bit of hydropower and nuclear, Russia has zeroed in on oil and civilian nuclear energy. So they've been, Lukoil has been involved in creating refinery sectors. They've been financing refineries, oil products pipelines in Congo, focusing on regional connectivity in the energy sphere and pipeline construction. Obviously, they have less assets or investment to bring to the table. So it's more about facilitating connectivity and kind of leveraging their vast presence in the oil market wherever they can. So it's a little bit more limited and a little more checked. They're getting in, Rosatom is getting involved in a lot of mega projects in Africa, or at least is trying to. They got MOUs all over the place and research centers, but the El Dabao one in Egypt is the only one that really seems to have gained long-term traction. But unlike China, which has really been cautious about getting into the weeds of major conflicts, as I was saying before, Russia has been inclined to get involved and actually become a major player in fragile state situations throughout the continent. We saw that early on in the mid-2000s during the war in Darfur, when they were major arms suppliers to Sudan, during the Ethiopian Eritrean War, where they actively sold arms to both sides. And this is both pragmatic, because there's a large demand within Africa for Russian military hardware, like MiGs, Pantsers, their tanks. They have military cooperation agreements with 21 countries, but it's also linked to their desire for great power status. So they want to be seen as a force that's involved in conflict resolution or a major player in conflicts around the world, as a way of reasserting themselves as a great power that the Americans, the Europeans, the French can't ignore. And that's applying towards their policies inside Africa. So think about the status gambits that we're seeing in Syria and the Middle East applying towards the African continent to theaters like Libya, where they're involved in support of Khalifa Haftar, but also in broader reshaping the institutional structures of that country, Central African Republic, Wagner Group deployments in Sudan. And unlike the Chinese, which are avoiding anything more than a very peripheral soft security footprint and guardianship, the Russian Wagner private military contractors are a lot more involved in combat operations on the ground. So that's quite significant. So there's similarities in their tactics, and both of them kind of frame themselves as like this antidote to neocolonialism, and this and to some degree counterweights to Western policy. But the resources that they have to bring to the table and the areas of focus are obviously quite different on both respects and both sides. So how do Russia and China interact in Africa? I'll briefly provide some remarks on this, and then we can kind of put this forward for the Q&A. As I said earlier, it's the problem is that they're not cooperating enough in these third theaters, especially Africa, than they are at the bilateral level. There's some areas of cooperation that I think briefly are worthy of note. For example, Russians and Chinese officials have shown solidarity against each other as part of their broader struggle against unilateralism, protectionism, and hegemony, as they both call it. Like, for example, the Russians have defended China against allegations of debt trap diplomacy. The Chinese have blocked reports about Russian Wagner Group abuses, particularly in Libya. So there's and also the media outlets tend to promote favorable stories about each other generally. So the Russians have defended China against allegations of racism. Sometimes Chinese media outlets have focused on the fact that Russia is actually promoting economic development and is countering neocolonialism in a somewhat positive way. So there's solidarity and synergies in terms of the narrative war, as well as in terms of defending against Western policies. That's one area of cooperation. A second area of cooperation is in the normative sphere. So the Chinese were obviously, for the first normative critics, the Russians were trying to engage with the West in the 1990s, particularly on areas like Somalia and Libya. But now both countries vote very regularly in a similar fashion on issues like sanctions against Zimbabwe, or issues like the no-fly zone in Libya, or defending Sudan during the Khartoum massacre against allegations of unlawfully killing civilians. There's also a bit of cooperation that's happening now in the sphere of maritime security. As some of you may have noticed, the November 2019 Russia, China, South Africa joint military exercise. as part of the cooperation that we're seeing inside the Indian Ocean. Maybe we'll see that spread further north up on the Indian Ocean, with Russia getting their base in Port Sudan, if that happens, and China having their facility in Djibouti. We have to see what happens there. So those are some areas of cooperation that I pinpointed. There's also the Russia-China Economic Summit that occurs. Very briefly, some areas of friction between the two. I think that the Chinese are acknowledging the fact that the tactical differences that Russia's employing could be problematic. In particular, China's reliance on a stable international order via the Belt and Road contrasts with Russia's desire to project power through being a disruptor on the continental stage. So Russia thrives on instability, China thrives on a stable regional order. That's an area where things are in conflict with each other. And even the Chinese are admitting that the Russians are focused on diplomatic status and military influence. China's focused on economic penetration, and they really don't discuss at a strategic level their policies and on coordinating those policies in the next decade or two. So that's a significant obstacle, is their strategies are different and they may not necessarily be compatible in the long run. There's concern, for example, inside China from interviews and research I've done about how Russian Wagner Group military activities and Russian indiscriminate arms sales might jeopardize BRI projects. And there were concerns about that and differences in policy that we see on the gradations. Like Russia was much more willing to embrace Haftar in Libya. China wanted to support the legitimate government. In CAR, the Russians' residual links with the ex-Seleka rebels were a problem. In Sudan, the Russians were much more concerned about authoritarian stability. China just wanted stability writ large. So there's a bit of a difference here. And there's obviously competition we're seeing between Russian and Chinese nuclear energy companies and economic and commercial entities. And we're seeing more competition rather than cooperation between Russian and Chinese policies, even in the public health sector, as we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic. So those are other obstacles and things that we'll see. So I think that it's unlikely that Russia and China, these differences are going to embroil into a major rivalry that's going to rival what we saw between the Chinese and the Soviets in Angola or in Zimbabwe during the latter stages of the Cold War. But equally, Africa is not necessarily going to be an area where cooperation between Russia and China is going to play a big role in strengthening their bilateral relationship. That's why I view them as something more than asymmetric rivals, but certainly something less than prospective partners. And that's how I'm going to conclude today. I look forward to your questions afterward.
Thank you very, very much, Sam. I think the depth and the breadth that you covered in a few minutes was admirable. Yeah, I mean, obviously the scale of Russia in Africa is much smaller and much more niche than what China is able to achieve. But it's very interesting looking at this. It reminds me of the game of Risk that we used to play as kids, with all this positioning of many powers, as you said, and as Henning said. Not only traditional powers like Russia and the USA, but China, Turkey, Israel, Iran. There are a lot of players jostling for position in Africa, and it's really an interesting take to have a look at them. There was one question, but I think I'll save it till the end. I'll come back to it. So next on the podium is my colleague, Kaylee Clifford, who is going to be talking about Russia's use of media in Africa, soft power in action. This is a paper that we co-wrote. And Kaylee is a researcher in our African governance and diplomacy program. And she leads our Russia-Africa project, but also has a keen interest in African governance. And Kaylee is joining us from the beautiful hills of KwaZulu-Natal. So Kaylee, take it away.
Thanks, Steve, for that introduction, and good afternoon to all of you. It's nice to be on the other side of proceedings for a change, joining as a panelist to share some research or initial research findings from a paper that Steve and I are working on, looking at Russia's use of media in Africa. And I say initial findings because it is still a work in progress, but we've nonetheless been able to pick up on some definite themes and patterns, which we thought would be good to share here today. First, I think it's important to understand that attempting to influence through the media is not a new phenomenon in Russia. We delve into some of that history in the paper, but with that in mind, it's easy to see how Russia's use of the media is often linked to its soft power, particularly in Africa. State-owned media services like Sputnik and RT really find resonance among African editors, And Russia's anti-imperialist credentials also have resonance among African elites. So we know that Russia, for example, makes a lot of never having colonized Africa, and many African leaders were educated in the USSR. Then there are efforts to combat Western narratives in the media and public opinion. This was actually a topic at the 2019 Russia-Africa Summit, where during a panel discussion on media cooperation, some speakers said that Russia was portrayed very negatively by the Western media. And on the other hand, that Russian outlets shared positive stories about Africa, and that contrasts with the Western media narrative of Ebola and civil war. At the summit, TASS announced that it would enhance partnerships with African media outlets. Media training for African journalists was offered. We know that RT has supported state broadcasters with equipment and finances. Of course, the emergence of digital communication channels has amplified the reach and the potential impact of some of this content, because the flow of information and the ability of states to convey messages directly to even foreign publics has really become easier and cheaper than ever. And so we're seeing a broadening of media operations to include online news websites and in several languages as well. I found this map quite useful, highlighting Russia's media presence in Africa, and I hope you can see it clearly from your screens. But the green areas are countries in which RT has a presence, meaning that it broadcasts on TV networks there. The countries that have stars on them, Morocco, Egypt, DRC, South Africa, these have all signed cooperation agreements with Russian state-owned media. So these are agreements to either share content and in some cases to train local journalists. And then the countries with triangles on them, Senegal, Ghana, Cameroon, Uganda, and some others, the leaders of their media outlets met with Putin in Sochi, and they have discussed further cooperation. So you can see Kremlin-sponsored media, particularly RT, is rising in popularity across the continent, and this is particularly the case when it comes to content produced in French. We ask ourselves, why is this important? Well, we know that Russia seeks to build influence in Francophone Africa, and the media forms part of the strategy. If we look at the type of content being shared, it's quite easy to pick out negative bias and a general anti-France narrative. And then African online news websites are republishing this content, so the messages get amplified far beyond their original source. The main message really being that while the West continues its tradition of exploiting Africa, Moscow is ready to engage with the continent on mutually beneficial terms. It is our sense that newspaper headlines sometimes tend to amplify and overestimate Russian influence in Africa. But I still think it's important to see Moscow's efforts to influence public opinion as part of its broader strategy, right? So to push back on liberal democracy on the one hand, and then to promote its interests on the other. Social media is, of course, a key aspect of Russia's media strategy in Africa, used to sow doubt, to build trust in alternative news sources. And unlike in previous information campaigns, Russian networks are increasingly working with local actors to kind of better disguise their activities. Interestingly, much of the content being shared is not necessarily fake news, as is often claimed, but in most cases is hyper-partisan and polarizing. Mali is a good example of this. So you can see the picture here shows supporters of the August 2020 coup celebrating in the streets, and in some other pictures you can see people carrying Russian flags and photos of Putin. And this was amid reports that some of the junta leaders who forced the president to step down were trained in Russia or had ties to the Kremlin. Although we know that Russia has supplied some military equipment to Mali at that time, Russia really didn't have any strong bilateral, cultural, or even historical ties with the country. But the groundwork for this kind of pro-Russian sentiment was laid already a year before, when social media sites started blaming France for Mali's militant Islamist insurgency in the north. And the Internet Research Agency, reportedly financed by Yevgeny Prigozhin, a Russian oligarch, is said to have paid local actors to post this kind of content on their behalf. Since the coup, Several more protests have sprung up in parts of Mali, all denouncing France's presence in the country and in some cases even calling for further cooperation with Russia. And this experience really mirrors other Russian-sponsored influence campaigns in Africa. If we look at Libya, for example, around the same time, criticisms of the West, the UN, and the UN-backed Government of National Accord became common on Libyan social media networks. And on the other hand, we see Russia being praised as a stabilizing actor. Dozens of social media accounts were identified, together racking up hundreds and thousands of followers. And although they presented themselves as domestic voices, they were based completely outside of Libya, and those accounts were eventually shut down. Having said that, though, we do know that Russian networks are increasingly outsourcing the creation of content to local actors. And this really gives influence campaigns a more cultural context, but it also makes it difficult for ordinary readers to identify inauthentic accounts. Moving our attention finally to the CAR, where we see how social media is actually being used in conjunction with on-the-ground techniques to build influence. We, of course, have to acknowledge the geopolitical relevance of the CAR in Africa due to its location, its mineral wealth, and local context. In 2019, the CAR signed a security cooperation agreement with Russia, really paving the way for Moscow to provide weapons and security training to the CAR's armed forces. And the Russian government's been quite open in its support for President Faustin Touadera, who is struggling to regain control over parts of the country from local warlords. His personal security detail reportedly includes 40 Russian military contractors, but apart from their military relations, Russia also has mineral interests in the CAR. But around the same time of this cooperation agreement, anti-French and UN messaging began to appear on social media in the CAR. And all of these pages posted quite similar content. They praised Touadera while simultaneously criticizing France for trying to recolonize the CAR and defending Russia's own presence in the country. In some cases, online trolls would even get into arguments with online influence operations run from France, and each side would try to kind of undermine one another. And I think this is important because media reports tend to focus on the threat of Russian digital aggression, but we know that there are also other governments that may be complicit in online influence campaigns, particularly where their interests are being challenged. So these social media accounts were really intended to build support for Russia in the CAR, but with only 4% of Central Africans having access to the internet, Russia needs to fortify its influence building with on-the-ground PR. Some of you will recognize this poster from a Russian Central African film feature called Tourista. It was shot in the CAR, previewed to thousands of people in Bangui in 2021. And the film essentially glorifies Russian mercenaries in the CAR. It was an opportunity for Russia to present itself as an ally. And 3 individuals have named Prigozhin as the financer of this film. Following its preview in Bangui, the French version of the film was amplified to reach wide audiences. Research shows coordinated and rapid sharing of the film across about 310 Facebook pages and groups. And the geographical coverage included, of course, the CAR, but also Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, the DRC, and the Congo. But it doesn't stop with the movie, because as with most sub-Saharan countries, radio is the most popular and widely accessible medium in the CAR. Radio Lengo Songo is financed by Lobai Invest. It's a mining company that's been linked to the Wagner Group. And the station has quite a large listenership in Bangui. It covers local news, but it's also published content supportive of Russia's presence in the CAR. And it's also not the only media outlet reportedly receiving financial assistance from Russia. Lobai Invest, interestingly, also sponsored a Miss Bangui beauty contest. And a security advisor to President Touadera, who is a Russian, appeared on stage actually to congratulate the winner and award her with the prize. When he was asked about his involvement in the contest, he said something like, "Russia's not just about arms. Security can come only when we change people's lives. We must create positive ground. And the beauty contest is really just one in a series of humanitarian, social, and cultural activities that have been sponsored in the CAR, sometimes by private companies like Labai Invest, but at other times by the Russian embassy. So it's clear that Russia's using a combination of soft power techniques to build influence in the CAR. It does receive quite a bit of praise for its support to the social and cultural activities. And in the streets of Bangui, the general opinion is that Russia is a new and a helpful development partner. But I also think it's important to note that the value of Russian investments in the CAR is quite low, because as in other parts of the continent where Russia is trying to build influence, it must do this on a limited budget. And that really brings me to some of the key takeaways so far, which is that, yes, there's a definite attempt to construct media narratives that portray Russia as an ally in Africa. Russian state-owned media outlets are key to this strategy. And yes, the Kremlin has adapted well to the digital age and is using social media to its advantage. But at the same time, social media platforms have really grown quite adept at identifying inauthentic behavior, as well as disinformation campaigns. And I think this, together with low connectivity rates on the continent, could be quite a challenge. And so ultimately, the success of efforts to build influence via the media is up for debate. Thanks.
Thank you, Kaylee, for a really excellent presentation, and it was great collaborating with you on this paper. Anybody who sees a resemblance between me and Muammar Gaddafi or Vladimir Lenin is absolutely, it's coincidental and not deliberate. So thank you. Yes, I mean, it's clear that Russia is not leaving the media to chance, that it has a deliberate strategy and tactics to really create the narrative, and its African presence is growing, and very interesting. I think the dynamics between Russia and France in the Sahel and other francophone regions of the continent. There's a real battle of ideas and battle of narratives, and you know, a lot of the literature talks about Russia deliberately, as you said, sowing confusion and putting truth in doubt, and saying there is no truth, and that there's always another version and there's always an agenda. So thank you very much for that. We'll move on to our next speakers, who are we've been working with them as part of this large project. Firstly, John Githongo, who is let me find my sheet here, sorry. John is the CEO of Inuka Trust Kenya, an NGO involved in governance issues, specifically corruption. He's currently researching Russia's presence in several African countries through The Elephant, a platform for dialogue and the pursuit of truth. John is also the subject of Michaela Wrong's excellent book, It's Our Turn to Eat, which talks about his experience being an anti-corruption campaigner in Kenya and the twists and turns and risks of that particular stance. So, John, we're really happy to have you. And he'll also be sharing his time with Khadija Sharif, a veteran journalist who has worked, among others, for the Organized Crime and Corruption Project. They're working together, looking at particular case studies of Russian interaction influence in Africa. So, John, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'll speak only briefly and give an overview of some of the findings that are beginning to emerge out of the work that we've done on case studies that focus on Mozambique, Angola, Zimbabwe, DRC. The Angolan case study is just gone into editing, and we hope that the Mozambique one will be ready soon as well. So I'll just take a step back and not go into the granular part of it, even though I know that Khadija is going to highlight some really interesting findings that have emerged at the granular level. Just four big things. Number one, we talk of our Russia policy towards Africa, but actually it looks as if there's a Kremlin policy towards Africa. There's Kremlin Inc. Geopolitics on a shoestring, and the Russians are able to adopt a very dynamic, opportunistic, and personalized approach when engaging with in and with Africa, and they've been able to take. They don't have the scale, the resources of the US or China, which is their primary competitor in the continent. And what's interesting about the way the Russians operate is their creative ability to turn their weakness into to leverage it for position, and to very quick on their feet. Diplomatically, in terms of military engagement, intelligence, in terms of financing, and on this fits in with the fact that the West, for a while, has pulled out of Africa, and the China, Russia, Turkey, India, etc., have come in to fill the space, and this is definitely the case with the countries that we are looking at. Their military sales remain a pillar of their engagement across the continent. Angola is the sort of their number 3 client on the continent, after Egypt and Algeria. And what is interesting about the Russian engagement, because they had a period after the fall of the Berlin Wall when they were until the mid 2000s when they were missing. So they're sort of testing the old tactics again. The Russian willingness to make mistakes, to wing it, and to make mistakes in terms of their diplomatic, political, and military engagement in Africa is very, very interesting. And they're willing to make expensive mistakes with human costs. And in both Mozambique and Angola, one of the examples of this is they use medical diplomacy, where they send groups of doctors into something which the Cubans also do in Africa. These have tended to go wrong, and quite expensively in terms of human cost, of course. And I won't go into the whole sort of saga around Cabo Delgado, but they're willing to absorb those costs. Interestingly, where they've in the countries that we've looked at, where they've made inroads, especially in the finance sector, with banks like VTB, GEMCorp out of the UK, it's interesting that the key actors are Russian actors, but who have been previously domiciled in Western financial institutions. And there's an overlap, in fact, in terms, if you look at the leadership of some of the VTB actors in some of these countries and those of GEMCorp, there's overlap that we are still studying. Then clearly, had the South African nuclear, $76 billion nuclear deal with Russia gone through, we'll be talking about a very different environment vis-a-vis Russia's engagement with Africa. There was this, it's just become apparent how much political capital had been invested in that by elites, not only in Russia, but within Africa, and the sense in which the South African elite in particular had brought together fellow liberation movement leaders to join them in this. Finally, is this hybrid between hard and soft power. Talking to the Russians are very successful, as I did mention before, in let me say, fluid, dynamic governance contexts, where countries are in the middle of some sort of civil strife or conflict, where you have fluid governance, where governance is in flux. The Russians do particularly well. So when talking to senior diplomats at the African Union, for example, those associated with Sahelan countries, Central African Republic, Mali, etc., they have an appreciation of Russia's new engagement with Africa that is not reflected in Western media. They say, no, the Russians are willing to put boots on the ground. They're quick. They move quickly, and of course, the Wagner Group is one of their one of the sharp end of their spear. A similar relationship exists in Cameroon with Israel, where they have very embedded Israeli military actors in the security services there. And so the elite attitude towards Russian engagement in the security sector is something that has to be taken quite seriously. It is valued as dynamic and is able to solve difficult problems quite rapidly. But let me hand over to my colleague Khadija to give us something a bit more granular. Khadija, thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. I'm not sure if it's currently being shared.
Yes, if you just put it on slideshow.
Yes.
Okay, there we go. So as John mentioned, we're investigating how Russia actually performs in Africa with documentary evidence rather than mythology and hearsay. And we've come across this interesting dynamic between the shadow and the body, what the reality is of the body on the ground versus the impression of Russia being active and performing in Africa. And one of the first things that we see is that Russia as a nation has no cohesive or concretized Africa strategy, but the Kremlin does. And it does this through repurposing institutional power with privateers, individuals that are at the helm or embedded within specific legal vehicles that don't perform from within Russia. Russia doesn't actually invest any cash in the deals, but it's collateralizing a service to certain African governments that's bartered with mineral resources. And this only works on the basis of opportunistic behavior. We'll go into case studies very shortly. One of the reasons why they're so successful is because they play off resentment. They're activating the historical context, particularly with partners that they frame as long-term stable business relationships. These are the dominant political regimes across Southern Africa, but also in other countries. Russia has one of, we'll go into why this is important. Russia has one of the lowest debt to GDP ratios because of the gold that the central bank has amassed, as well as diversifying currencies to get around Western sanctions. And their engagement with Africa through the Kremlin, this privatized parallel entity, shows that the state is in service to the Kremlin, as we know, rather than the Kremlin acting on behalf of the public interest. We're able to see the flow of these privatized Russian origination funds from conduit and shell banks that are Russian in entity, but use different secrecy jurisdictions for end destination in politically stable regions like Luxembourg and Switzerland. Because, for example, if any bank in the Bahamas or Mauritius were to fail, the state would not be able to bail it out. So these secrecy jurisdictions are caught between coconut and criminality. They're not really an end destination, it's a conduit. We're able to see that media sensationalism, particularly how the West covers Africa, has actually positively enhanced how the Russians perform in Africa. Because a lot of the African governments, especially the dominant parties, have been fairly or unfairly targeted, and that taps into a kind of a legacy and a historical tango between African regimes that are the de facto liberation parties and governments, as well as the Kremlin that moves under the Russian flag or nationality. So the first case study we're going to go into very quickly is about Sudan. Sudan was under US sanctions at the time, but when we tracked actual exports from Sudan through the sanctioned SFS arm from the central bank, we were able to see that the West actually, not hypocritical, but they create laws such as Dodd-Frank that are so fragmented that their own sanctions don't work. So we could see $2.5 billion in gold going from Darfur, Africa's third largest gold mine called Jabal Amir. The 300,000 people displaced, the Janjaweed as a third force helping to extract the gold. And from Dubai, which was a secrecy jurisdiction that also refined the gold, it moved on to Switzerland, where LBMA-backed refiners like Valcambi would sell it on to Apple and Intel. So at a certain point, 2016 onwards, Russia entered, and we were able to see that they established companies that didn't require any expertise. This is all alluvial gold mining They blocked the UNSC report on Sudanese gold and the role of the Janjaweed as a way of acquiring political capital. And from 2012 onwards, but particularly 2016, you see the Russian central bank amassing bullion reserves, something like 60 to 80 billion, which was one of the 4th to 6th largest global acquisitions of gold at that time. And we can see that these global structures used red herrings like M-Invest. So they kind of dangle a bit of false news to the media, which latches onto it, while at the same time completing their business in a very cost-effective way. And at the end of the day, these gold reserves, as we know, directly affects your debt to GDP ratio. It affects how sanctions, how dollar-denominated issues, how external sovereign risks affects the country. So they very cleverly managed how to get around sanctions and not be affected or impacted by it using creative means. In Africa, particularly Southern Africa, we can see that the strongest ties to the Kremlin come from the dominant political parties that are perceived or try to frame themselves as legitimate liberation movements. They have these legacy ties outside of Southern Africa. They work with these authoritarian regimes that are also long-term state, Mozambique, Angola. And while these parties are suspended above the societies they claim to govern, while there's a lot of militancy and militarism within these societies, and while the societies, these governments are constructed as corporations in a way, that mutuality does allow for a reaction that uses resentment against the West for its very real and imagined hypocrisy, and that nostalgia to kind of strengthen relationships, because Russia is also oil and gas dependent. Many African countries are oil and gas or other resource enclave unit dependents. So there's a lot of similarities that see it more as a natural ally than a foreign superpower coming in. In Angola, we could see that, and in many other Southern African countries, we can see that the regime actually performs as a corporation, whether it's through empowerment vehicles, offshore vehicles. Money does not flow in suitcases. It kind of flows in shareholding structures, especially exceptional shareholding structures, or through loans and other means. So it's a very easy way of negotiating a buy-in between the Kremlin and the dominant political parties. But one of the things I very quickly wanted to touch on was the role of sanctions as a business opportunity. You know, there's a lot that's been written about the Central African Republic, but because of the arms embargo from 2013 on the Central African Republic, our case study kind of shows that Russia stepped in to provide free small arms to the country when the anti-militia efforts needed to take place. Although the EU provided training to the army does not actually have arms. So the militants are better armed than the actual government. And this is where, you know, in regards to pushing back against these 6 militant groups, Russia actually stepped in and bartered access for gold and diamonds. Again, it doesn't require any expertise. It's just alluvial. And they created Chinese named companies as a way of distracting away from the media who were looking once again at the red herrings like Lobai Invest. And of course, there were agreements set up with that, but those served as a distraction. In Sudan, we went through the Sudanese case study. We could see that the primary means and one of the reasons why they performed through the CAR was as a springboard to get these gold resources. In Zimbabwe, the world's 3rd largest platinum mine, I think it has an overall value of $86 billion in platinum group metals, has a Russian private partner. Public debt was used to buy out $220 million worth of military investments. So these are kickback structured as payments. And a Zimbabwean cutout, Kuda Tagurai, who represented private interests in the government, was able to step in because the role of the Zimbabwean military was too visible as a PEP. So in this deal, as in many others, again, Russia provides no financing. What they did was leverage private banks to provide loans that were collateralized with minerals at a very high interest rate. So although the Russian state did back, they own a shareholding in this private bank, the actual role was hidden and very opaque means were used to maintain an interest in this platinum mine. Russia, of course, is an expert in extracting platinum. They have the world's largest platinum reserve, followed by South Africa. In the DRC, again, we could see the way in which financial mechanisms perform very covertly. Spurbank, a state-owned bank, facilitated the extraction of cobalt from the DRC, indirectly in partnership with Dan Gertler. And they were aware of evidence showing bribery, corruption, bonus payments to fixers who made taxes and other issues disappear. There was the use of the UAE, particularly DMCC located bank accounts, as a financial springboard to kind of circumvent Western sanctions. But once again, where there are sanctions, there's a lot of business opportunity for countries like Russia that don't have the power of capital, that don't have the prowess of the Chinese government to step in, and also that don't provide these niggling box tick compliance systems that Western countries require. In Angola, we could see billions of dollars in backdoor financing from VTB and GEMCorp for sovereign debt, exorbitant interest rates, used by private elites in Angola. And it involved products and services that were sold by the same parties who are arranging and financing the deal. So this, again, is a technique that the Russian government itself uses for its own sovereign debt, LPN notes that are private side traded. So it doesn't actually get formally logged as part of the debt because they work on the basis of big boy letters of credits. In terms of arms, we can see that Africa is the biggest market, for Rosaboron export. But while over 40% of the book value is allocated to Africa, this doesn't necessarily mean that arms that are ordered will be delivered as scheduled. There's a lot of inflated contracting done without public bidding. Costs can be added as refurbishments. Training can be provided for other purposes, but allocated to use of specific weapons. So it gives them a kind of a gray area to perform other activities. We saw this in the Niger with arms, helicopters, 30% pricing inflation, and then agents that were used as conduits of kickbacks between the African state and the Russian government, with VTB bank accounts based in countries like Germany. So because of the sanctions, Russia again outsources to other jurisdictions that have a veneer of legitimacy to the Western lens. So ultimately, from these 5 case studies, from the evidence, we can see that Russia performs as a kind of a hustler, as a kind of a chess player, but not a chess player that's playing in a tournament. It's a chess player that's playing for money in a park. It's very gritty, it's opportunistic, it's not a cohesive plan that's concretized and formal. It kind of plays by ear to see which African governments are blocked and what can be bartered. And where their financial systems do come to play, this is done through private financing mechanisms at very high interest rates. So ultimately, Russia does not invest any capital because it doesn't really have any capital to invest in African governments. So they are the preferred partner for a number of reasons, not least because they seem to have more in common with the governments that they are performing with, rather than the so-called superpowers that come in with a bigger body but a smaller shadow. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Steve, you're muted.
Sorry, thank you. Fascinating work that you and John are doing, drilling down really into what's happening on the ground, and also providing a bird's eye view of that. I like the image of chess players hustling in the park for money. Does that bear out? Is that what we can conclude from the way that Russia operates? So thank you very much, both of you, for that. And our last speaker, and then we'll go to questions, is Zvínka Kachur. She is a researcher at Stellenbosch University Center for Complex Systems in Transition in South Africa. Her work focuses on energy in Africa, specifically nuclear energy. She's also interested in disinformation and other Russian influences in sub-Saharan Africa. She's done 2 papers for us now. One is out already. I'll send the link, and one is in production at the moment. Last year, she had a look at Russian involvement in Zimbabwe and Mozambique. And this year, and this paper, and what she's going to talk to us a little bit about today, is Russian involvement in Tanzania and Zambia. So, Zvínka, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Stephen.
Can you just make sure? There we go.
So I'm going to cover historical capital that Russia inherited from the Soviet Union, the nuclear cooperation and interests of Russian state companies, as well as trade between Zambia, Tanzania, and Russia in the period of 2011 and 2020. I'll end up with a new strategy, how Russia can bring all it's built, all it inherited from the Soviet Union and built in a period of 1991-2020 to a Russia-Africa Partnership Forum. So the new strategy that basically started with a Russia-Africa Summit in 2019. So if you look at the historical connections with the Soviet Union, there are 4 critical areas that still come to play. First of all, as some of the speakers already mentioned, social capital linked to Russian ideological connections through decolonization, Africa socialism, and we can see that also in Zambia and Tanzania. Secondly, there are 8 Russian centers in the Africa cultural centers, and 2 of them are in Zambia and Tanzania. This is a physical space that provides opportunities to organize Russian classes and different cultural events, as well as political events, and serves as a physical space for alumni of Russian universities. Throughout the time of the Soviet Union and support for decolonization and support for African independence, Russia provided scholarships to students. For example, till nowadays, around 100 students receive scholarship from Tanzania, and around 600 students come from Zambia. That's for 2020. So those connections that were built during the Soviet Union time, they still remain in place. Similar for military cooperation, students not only studied engineering and medicine or other subjects, but including military training that a number of currently in place officials in Tanzania and Zambia would receive in Russia. If we talk about the heritage of military cooperation, both Zambia and Tanzania also has some of the military equipment that they received during the Soviet Union time. And that equipment needs to be serviced. It means provide opportunities for collaborations and contacts. The third area is Soviet debt. Predominantly because of providing military support, but also to some of the infrastructural projects. Both Zambia and Tanzania developed significant debt in front of the Soviet Union. Throughout the 20s, Russia tried to restructure it, and actually almost 80% of those debts were forgiven for both Zambia and Tanzania, with remaining around $100 million that Zambia and Tanzania were meant to pay during the next 33 years. In 2007, Putin approved a new strategy of dealing with that Soviet debt that Russia inherited, called Debt for Development. Predominantly, it allows Zambia and Tanzania to use those money that they had to pay back to Russia to implement some of the projects, developmental projects in their territory. But practically, the contracts need to be negotiated with Russia, providing an opportunity for Russia to participate in the infrastructural projects or other projects, get access to the market. As example shows from both Tanzania and Zambia, despite this agreement was signed in 2000, the program was signed in 2007, and agreements with Zambia and Tanzania signed around 2010, the projects are still not approved. So there is no progress in those projects. There is a number of reporting how Russia is trying to access to those money, but the agreement has not been achieved. And even in the Russia-Africa summit in 2019, the question was raised again. Zambia and Tanzania were advised to participate in similar projects like successes in Madagascar, where Russia actually did receive access to natural resources through this program. The fourth area is academic expertise. The Institute for African Studies was established in 1959, and till nowadays it has around 100 academics with years of experience in African studies in connections to research institutes in Africa. If you look at the period of 2006-2014, leaving out the times when I'm actually going to focus a little bit. Between 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and 2006, a number of joint enterprises were established between Russia and Zambia and Tanzania. So there was an attempt to use those connections that were built during the Soviet times to create new type of economic cooperation, to set up private interstate companies. However, none of them survived and succeeded. Majority of those companies would transfer to private hands. A number of investigations were happening in how those companies would get out of the state ownership, but basically it was the process of creating oligarchs in Russia, and it also received its waves abroad, including in Zambia and Tanzania. So those enterprises that were established in 1991, 1996, so during 90s, did not survive till nowadays. If you talk about period 2006-2014, and 2006 marks return of Russia to Africa in the sense of Vladimir Putin coming with his first visit, a number of Russian state companies were trying to receive access to natural resources. For Zambia and Tanzania, these attempts were unsuccessful. For example, Rosgeo, the company that was established based on Zarubezh Geologia, multi-industry geological holding, which done investigation into natural resources in a number of African companies, was trying to get access to gold mining in Tanzania and signed non-binding agreement in 2012, but that didn't go well, so it didn't move forward. Gazprom also bidded to receive access in gas projects in Tanzania, also unsuccessful. Lukoil in Zambia tried to secure a contract in 2009-2010, also unsuccessful. So out of all state companies that are tightly controlled by Kremlin at the moment, none of them succeeded in Zambia, Tanzania, apart from Rosatom. Rosatom received control over uranium mine, Mkuyu River project in 2010 in Tanzania, and received the license for mining in 2013. When that happened, there was aspirations that this project will bring Tanzania to one of the 5 largest uranium exporters in the world. However, because of the drop of the prices in uranium and some other challenges linked to the taxation ongoing till nowadays, this project has not been developed as planned. For Zambia, since 2015 and the President Lungu's strategy to develop nuclear science, nuclear power plants in Zambia by 2040, the nuclear cooperation with Russia was going really well, and the Center for Nuclear Science and Technology is in the process of establishing. So since 2015, as mentioned by the previous speaker, Russia faced a number of challenges with economical cooperations, and the idea was to improve the trade between the two countries. As we can see on this graph, the trade hasn't improved dramatically apart from Tanzania. If you look at the first line, in 2016, in Tanzania was Russia-Tanzania Economic Forum, chaired by the Ministry of Industry. And after, at the same time, the agreement of military cooperation was signed at the same forum. And after that, this increase in the trade is predominantly because of cereals and fertilizers. And they remain now a little bit high. But if you look at those numbers, they are still extremely low if we compare to any other major powers in Africa. Similar to Tanzania, there is a little increase in 2019 in the trade with Zambia, which is mainly because of the nuclear program. So the trade between Russia, what Russia exports to Zambia, three major positions: vehicles, fertilizers, precious stones, and metals. Zambia to Russia sends tobacco, black metal, trees, and flowers. And if you look at Russia, Tanzania, there's cereals, fertilizers, paper. And Tanzania to Russia, tobacco, coffee, tea, fruits, and seeds. So in 2019, the new strategy is expecting to bring together the Russian Export Center, the key financial instrument to avoid the sanctions that is working through its share with Afreximbank to fund some of the projects, including, as we've seen, the increase in the trade in fertilizers. The agreement to Zambia was funded through this specific mechanism when the funding was provided by Afreximbank and Russian Export Center. The other key players that should improve the opportunities for Russian state companies is Association of Economic Cooperation with African States, AECAS, which is registered as non-profit organizations to give it more flexibility, but it was established by the presidential directive, by Putin's directive. And it unites key state-owned companies that have their presence or plan to increase their presence in the African countries, such as Gazprom Bank, Transmash Holding, V Holding, Uralkali, Alrosa, and Rosatom. Recently, in 2021, those six companies were joined also by Innopractica, another state-owned institution. So the new Russia-Africa Partnership Forum will try to bring together that social capital that Russia built, the Soviet Union, that Russia inherited from the Soviet Union, such as Россотрудничество, the Institute for African Studies, and mix it with a business organization. Throughout 2020, we've seen a number of online events organized by those organizations together, where AECAS, REDS, Россотрудничество, and the African Institute organize events together, bringing the alumni and the business companies to the same platforms. So the expectation is that using that social capital will improve business opportunities of Russian companies on the continent. I also wanted to mention an interesting case of COVID-19 mitigation techniques that Russia used in Tanzania. In August 2020, Russia decided to open borders to only 3 countries in the world. One of them was Tanzania. It happened just a few months before the elections in Tanzania, and also created the influx of Russian tourists to Tanzania that were empty after as all European countries closed down to Tanzania. So up until April, for a few months, from August 2020, borders were open, and the number of tourists grew from 6,000 in 2019 to 43,000 in only last 3 months of 2020. After the change after the President Magufuli died and the government has changed, Russia imposed restrictions on flight from Russia to Tanzania, and that restrictions remain till nowadays, until 1st November of 2021. It might be interesting that Hussein Mwinyi, who was for many years Minister of Defense of Tanzania, was elected as president of Zanzibar, the key area where Russian tourists went. So as a conclusion, Russia inherited the financial and human capital of the Soviet Union. However, it did not manage to translate it into the present economic benefits in Zambia and Tanzania. So far, Russian state corporations failed to secure access to natural resources in Zambia and Tanzania. However, there is that option remains open. If you look at the funding that Zambia requires for a nuclear program at the moment, there are clear messages delivered, for example, by the representative of Russian parliament, Valentina Matvienko, suggesting that Russia can support to fund the nuclear program in Zambia in return for natural resources, access to natural resources. Nuclear cooperation in Zambia increased the frequencies of contacts between legislative, financial, and military institutions. We've seen that the legislation in Zambia on nuclear developed in a similar way as in Russia, but it also provides opportunity to design legislation in the area of IT and others in a similar manner that would benefit Russian companies in the future. The trade between Russia and Zambia and Tanzania is growing, but significant breakthroughs has not been yet achieved. I guess the expectation is that this new strategy with establishing of Russia-Africa Partnership Forum can provide that opportunity to improve Russian economic perspectives on the continent, and especially including Zambia and Tanzania. I just wanted to know that I excluded from my presentation the topic of military cooperation just because of time, as well as more clandestine organizations that Russia has been using, like Afrik and IRA. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much, Zdenka. It's interesting to also look at countries like Zambia and Tanzania, which are not countries in conflict. A lot is said about Central African Republic and Libya and Mali. It's also interesting to see what happens in countries with stable political systems and how Russia seeks and as you've shown, sometimes fails to achieve its objectives. So can I just ask you to stop sharing if you wouldn't mind? Great, thank you. Okay, we've had a lot of questions that have come in. I'm going to try and get through as many of them as possible. We've got about 40 minutes. Let's go to the chat. Sorry. So the first one, Sam, I think is for you, and it was asking, it was from Vyacheslav. Don't you think that China's policy in Africa is a new form of colonialism? Russia is trying to play by the rules of both parties, which often doesn't allow us to win tenders and or contribute to the corruption of the elite. And then there was also a question which you can answer at the same time. Let me go down. From Alexandra. Dear Samuel, I would kindly appreciate if you could tell us more about the figures about Russian arms deals. I find your approach of Russian desire for power status very appealing, though much disappointing in terms of real implementation. So if you could tackle those two, please.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, definitely. I'm very happy to address those two. So, with respect to China and neocolonialism and the distinction with Russia, one of the main sources of criticism of China is obviously the fact that there's a lot of debt that's coming through towards African countries, right? Like whether it be the $25 billion that Angola, for example, owes China, down to some of the current disputes that we're seeing with Nigeria, and then also Zambia, is that these ownership of assets and these desires to kind of influence the political and military governance models in these countries, which extends from security sector reform to training to investment, is really aimed at eroding the sovereignty of these countries over the course of time. So that's a credible argument, and it's something that we should remain vigilant of. We should also remain vigilant of the fact that China has been very good at creating public opinion for itself and soft power for itself compared to Russia. For example, when you look at public opinion surveys of countries in Africa, whether it be South Africa, Uganda, Morocco, Tunisia, so North Africa and Sub-Saharan, if you look at them laterally over the course of time from 2014 and onwards, Russia is always around like 35, 40% favorable. The more Russia invests, the more Russia seems to do on the continent, even in terms of media, even in terms of projects, the Sochi summit, the BRICS summit, things like that. It struggles to really build traction at the popular level, whereas China's very public investments, whether they be in the context of their public works projects, economic diversification projects, they seem to be shooting their positive image into the 60 to 70% range. So people can kind of feel that these and kind of believe and kind of follow into some of the win-win ideas, and they can actually be duped in the process because those win-win ideas may be actually undergirded by this kind of violation of sovereignty. Because China is in some ways better at packaging its neo-colonial instincts, or the more and distracting from and deflecting from of the more subversive elements of its policies than Russia are. So, which is why I think in the Western media, I mean, obviously recently there's been an attention towards like this debt trap diplomacy construct, which I think is flawed, and I think it's like kind of it should be more nuanced correctly. But the and Russian activities, whether it be the Wagner Group or whether it be anything that Russia does that's pernicious, is seen as something that should be sanctioned or something that should be targeted. And it's kind of a bit of a different connection here. So that's the problem. And I would say that it's not accurate to say necessarily that Russia is not interested in enabling kleptocracy in Africa. I mean, certainly if you look at what Rusal has been doing, for example, in Guinea, in the close relationship with the Guinean state, and Alpha Conde and state capture of the bauxite, which is not something that's new. That's something that began with Lansana Conte's visit to Moscow back in 2001. That's 20 years in the making. And now with the arrival of Prigozhin and now with the expansion of Rusal's influence, it's just grown and thrived. That's certainly an example of where Russia is involved in facilitating a state capture. Obviously, there'd be the case of Russia and what was going on with Jacob Zuma and the civilian nuclear energy projects. That's another case where state capture is at play. The Russian seizure of 3 of the 5 major oil ports in Libya by the Wagner Group. That's another example. Russian Wagner Group involvement in the guardianship of gold mines or diamond mining in Central African Republic. In fact, most of Russia's economic deals where they are successful, I think, are contributing to kleptocracy and are contributing towards elite corruption. That's where they're trying to push for more expansive, more diversified economic deals, or in countries that have a bit more of a more stable governance. That's where Russia seems to struggle. So when Russia's trying to extend its nuclear MOUs in countries that are more diversified economies, like Nigeria, or I guess pre-Tigray, I guess you could look at perhaps at Ethiopia, they're not really making much headway. So Russia, I would disagree very strongly with the notion that Russia is not contributing to kleptocracy. I think, in fact, it thrives in kleptocratic and fragile state situations. And China is better at window dressing the neocolonialism around its policies in Russia. So up until recently, it's maybe attracted less international criticism, though I think that is now starting to be seen through. So that's why I look at, but both Russia and China, much like Turkey, much like other countries, tend to view their policies as counterweights to Western colonialism. And in particular, I think when you're looking at the Sahel and Central Africa, to the models that are being put forward by French colonialism. So that's just my overall response to that question. With response to Alexandra's interesting point on arms sales versus other factors, absolutely. One of the big problems with Russia's involvement in Africa is really, what are they going to be achieving in terms of actual deals, in terms of actual transactions? If you look at the Sochi summit, there may be 12 billion or 13 billion in new deals were signed, depending on how you calculate the value of certain infrastructure assets, because those are variable. But in reality, there has been maybe a bit of a movement towards some kind of mining for arms, informal deal with Zimbabwe. There's been a little bit of a discussion about reviving the Ajakuta steel mill in Nigeria. So that's something that seems to be keep getting delayed year after year, and its value is questionable. But most of the nuclear energy, most of the mining projects, most of the new projects that were agreed to at the Sochi summit did not really come anywhere near close to coming to fruition. So they were all really real smoke and mirrors and not much in the way of actual achievement. And that extends, as I noted earlier, to Russian soft power. No matter what Russia seems to do, its soft power seems to be stuck. It might have positive images amongst the older generation of Africans who have nostalgia for the past, but certainly not amongst the younger generations. They're struggling to break through with millennials and younger generation people. Russia's just seen and associated often with state capture or with private military contractor human rights abuses or supporting autocracies or other things. So I agree absolutely with Alexander's point that most of what Russia's talking about in terms of status is, I think, more for their own domestic self-image and more for their image to anti-Western partners outside of Africa, arguably, in the Middle East and Latin America, maybe even a status kind of a shot towards China and the Indo-Pacific, but it's not really aimed at really winning or changing hearts and minds inside Africa because they're not being able to do that. a bit more granularity with regards to Russian arms deals. So Russia has obviously been, after a brief dip in the early to mid 1990s, where Russia kind of fell out of the top 5 in terms of arms vendors, Russia has reemerged as the leading arms vendor to African countries. It generally hovers around 35 to 38%, I believe, of the continent's total. But Russia's arms deals in Africa are obviously not dispersed throughout the continent. They may have 21 military cooperation agreements, but many of those military cooperation agreements are focused on things like counterterrorism assistance training, anti-piracy, and defense capacity building, are not necessarily linked to transactional arms sales. That's the important thing to keep in mind. A lot of them are more the other elements of security, not necessarily commercial. Obviously, Algeria is overwhelmingly the biggest partner for African countries. There have been years in the past 5 where Algeria has actually contributed more arms sales from Russia than any other country on the continent. Egypt obviously is very significant with regards to the recent Su-35 deals that might be coming forward, as well as a longstanding history of contracts there. So Egypt and Algeria are significant. Libya was pretty significant before the 2011 war, until the arms embargo came in. So they were important, and they might revive now that elections are being held in December, especially if a Kremlin-friendly candidate, we've seen Haftar entering the mix, somebody gets at least a position of power, if not actually winning the presidency. So that's something to watch. In sub-Saharan Africa, Russia's arms deals are pretty much scattered. I mean, I think Ethiopia and Eritrea have been reliable clients through the late 1990s and early 2000s. I think that as the Tigrayan crisis worsens, we should watch for more Russian arms transfers towards Ethiopia. Angola is another important country, the first country in sub-Saharan Africa where they crossed $1 billion in arms contracts in 2013. They've been rumoring to pick up the S-400, but that seems to be a bit of a bridge too far. But certainly Angola has been interested in Russian missile defense systems and Russian weaponry of all kinds. So they're another player to watch in the Russian arms industry. I think to some degree, we should be looking at Russian arms contracts towards other countries like Rwanda is one, because Rwanda and Russia cooperate in Central African Republic. That's quite significant. Nigeria is another, obviously, because the Russians stepped in when the Americans did not provide the Apache jets in 2014, and when Obama was criticizing Nigeria on what they would do in terms of human rights. So there are other partners to look at. In Central Africa and most of the rest of Western Africa, as well as East Africa, I mean, I think that the depth of arms sales and arms deliveries to big players like Kenya, Tanzania, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ghana, other places, not much, right? So it's not really that significant. So it's very unequally dispersed, but that's a brief lay of the land of what Russian arms sales look like on the continent. And I'll try to answer the other first question, which was a bit controversial and a little loaded. So I hope I did a decent job.
Great. Thanks, Sam. So the next one was just a comment from Asefa Adamasi from Ethiopia, who said, yes, it's good to recognize that Africans themselves have to decide their future. So the engagement of Russia and China in Africa is important to balance the bullying and interventionist approach of the West. China delivers tangible results and not empty words and rhetoric. Kaylee, there was a question to you from Alexandra. Thank you for your presentation. I'm curious to find out the source of the links to Russian connection to influence of the content of local media. Do you want to tackle that one?
Sure. So a lot of the research was done by the Stanford Internet Observatory, specifically research linking Russia's media influence in Africa to Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Internet Research Agency. And this research was done sometimes in conjunction with or on behalf of social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, which, as I mentioned, are getting better and better at identifying inauthentic behavior online, whether that be accounts that present themselves as being authentic local voices, but which are being run from elsewhere, perhaps Russia, or even third-party locations like we saw in Ghana in 2020 when a Russian troll farm was discovered there. So it could be that, but it could also be, picking up on efforts or efforts to push certain narratives. Maybe I'll add that all of these studies are referenced in the paper, but I'll be happy to forward those to you as well, Alexandra.
Thanks, Kaylee. So Rolf Pretorius says, as long as we in Africa, sorry, there's a huge storm outside, so I hope you can hear me. As long as we in Africa keep in mind that the first responsibility for our development lies with ourselves, and as such, we have to stay in control of our own countries and not outsource it away. Okay, we had the arms deal question. Assefa said, in my opinion, the Russians are still timid in their engagement with Africa as compared with the aggressive scramble for Africa by the West and China. Louis Marie was asking more about the Mozambique case. Zvika, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about Mozambique and Russian connections. Can you unmute?
Yes, I think Mozambique and Russia has a long history of collaboration, and also more recent development and military cooperation was quite promising. However, after the Wagner Group's arrival to Mozambique and unsuccessfully tried to manage Delgado project, for a while, the relationship got a little bit more complicated. So this is the area to watch and to see how that can be transformed, and if that can be changed into more working relationship.
Yes, thank you. I think the Wagner Group didn't stay very long in Mozambique. It was not really able to deal with the problem, and it's become more complicated since then. John, maybe the next question can go to you on Wagner Group. The question was, can you anything to say about the intervention of the Wagner Group in Africa? What is your research or your thinking on private military contractors, in particular this one?
Well, of course, the Wagner Group functions like many of these Kremlin sort of linked entities in the shadows, and I think the Wagner Group has been overhyped, and a part of that hype is driven by the Russian media, but also by Western media. Essentially, they're able to go in quite low tech. What they show a willingness to do is to put boots on the ground. They're aggressive. They're not peacekeepers. They're peacemakers. Their instructors are willing to engage, which is appreciated by elites, by ruling elites, especially those who feel under threat. But I think their capacity is a lot more limited than has been made out. There's a lot of hyperbole about the ability and reach of the Wagner Group in various African countries. However, in Mali, yes, the Russian troll factories are pushing a narrative of people being excited about the Wagner Group assisting with their problems there. But talking to Malian diplomats and members of the Malian elite, the academia based in Senegal, there is a genuine appreciation about what they were willing to do. There's a recognition that it's a low tech, very rough and ready operation. That it's a bootstrap. Russia simply doesn't have the resources to pull off the kind of interventions that the US, France, and others do. You're muted, Steve.
Sorry, I'm trying to keep the storm away. It's really howling outside. I think we're in a hurricane. A question from Paul Stronsky, who I think is in the US. Could the panelists address Russia's recent moves in Sudan? Tacit backing for the military takeover? Is it all about desire to get logistics, facility? What else? Who would like to comment on Sudan? Sam?
Yeah, I can comment on Sudan. Yeah, sure. So I've been tracking, obviously, the Sudan issue very closely in the last 2 chapters of my book. So I just wanted to kind of just very briefly outline what I found. Obviously, Russia's interest in establishing a naval facility in Sudan is nothing new. And it's reflective of a broader ambition of getting a frontier on the Red Sea after they secured a foothold in the Mediterranean. The impetus for the Russian-based idea in Sudan, Russian power projection in that country, actually came through the Federation Council from my research, and then as time went on, it started to get accepted more by the organs of the Russian security establishment, and then the Kremlin, Lavrov, Putin writ large. So it came really more from the upper house, initially some of these ideas over here. The concept of the Port Sudan base that kind of came forward really emerged in 2017 when Omar al-Bashir visited Moscow and really she actually met with Vladimir Putin and asked for protection from the United States. And Russia was seen as the country that could protect Sudan against American unilateralism. And there initially were nothing really much was happening with regards to the Sudan base, and it appeared in early 2019 when Bashir was overthrown that maybe the project entirely would be nixed. But negotiations persisted in the year and a half that followed, particularly between the Sudanese military, Burhan, and the Russian state, and largely bypassed the civilian government. That's what seemed to have happened. And that led to the deal that was announced and rolled out last year that Russia would be establishing a long-term military foothold in Sudan that would act as both a resupply facility from Tartus and also a gateway to broader Russian power projection inside the Indian Ocean region. Due to the unpopularity of the terms and the opacity of the terms and the belief that Sudan was effectively leasing land to Russia for free, it caused a lot of pushback, and then it was put towards renegotiation in May and June. Since the coup, Burhan has hinted that he will bring it back. I think that while the base is by no means a completely done deal, I think that it is something that is more likely to occur, at least if the Burhan-Hemeti coalition remains in power. It really depends on the military having an upper hand over the civilian authorities. That's an important thing to keep in mind. The Russian relationship with Hemeti, from what I've seen, who's the head of the Rapid Support Forces, is nowhere near as strong as the partnerships that he's cultivated with Saudi and UAE. And the Russians seem to be negotiating with Burhan on this deal. So that's something to watch. Also, there's other things that we should see too. I mean, the base or any kind of Russian presence in Sudan is aimed at legitimizing and legalizing Russia's presence, because the Watergrid presence that's residually there have largely retreated to the shadows since the Khartoum massacre, and they're really only involved in the guardianship of gold reserves. So this allows them to legalize and legitimize their presence. It gives them a potential access point to the Indian Ocean, and that can lead to more cooperation with India even in that area, and also challenge the freedom of navigation from Americans and Europeans, as well as act as something of a counterweight to what China has in Djibouti. Yeah, I don't think the two countries are going to be sharing facilities or really negotiating anytime soon. Russia did briefly try to branch out and establish closer ties with the civilian authorities after the democratic transition took forward. But if you look at Russian academic literature, there's always the belief that authoritarian stability is really the only way to keep Sudan together, and that any movement towards democratization in Sudan was compared unfavorably towards the Euromaidan revolution or to Western efforts to divide the Sudanese state, which they believe began with the secession of South Sudan in 2012. So the formal discourse was welcoming the transition, but the private discourse in Russian academic and media commentaries certainly were more in favor of an autocratic solution, which is why Russia has not really called the coup a coup coming from Burhan and has been pretty much happy with the current state of affairs. That's kind of how I see what's happening. I think the base is pretty likely, but much depends on whether Sudan maintains this, unfortunately, this authoritarian rollback rather than a democratic trajectory.
Peter Henshaw asks, are there examples of Russia's personalized approach to engagement with African leaders causing problems for China? I think, Sam, that's probably also for you.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's a very interesting question. I mean, obviously, China has obviously been trying to establish relations with African countries that are a lot more holistic, right? They're economic sector to sector, as I was describing. They're aimed at like engaging not just the leaders at the top, so not just the Robert Mugabes of the continent, but like, you know, the party cadres underneath them, and the diplomatic and security apparatuses that support those strong executives. Whereas Russia, to some degree, does have just a bit more of a strongman to strongman strategy, right? So like the relationships between Putin and Alpha Conde, or the relationships between Putin and Mugabe, and Putin and Sisi. I'm just thinking of relationships across the continent that do seem to follow that way. And Russia has been trying to obviously export its governance model a little bit. Lavrov has been participating in intra-party summits that resemble what China has been involved in. He gives speeches to them. Mikhail Bogdanov, who's the Russian deputy foreign minister, has been involved also in shuttling around in some of those kind of lower level conferences. But we really don't see the kinds of institutionalized 2+2 relationships between Russia, defense and foreign ministries and lower levels of government really getting together and really forming inside Africa, like you're seeing with some of their Middle Eastern partners like Iran, Turkey, and Egypt and others. So it seems to be a lot more reliant on personalized politics, I would say. Though there is a trend, I think, in the economic sphere between Russian and African business councils. They're worth watching and seeing what's happening. Russian State Duma delegations, it started off mostly with North African countries like Egypt. That might be spreading more towards sub-Saharan African countries like Angola. I mean, there's more Duma to legislative interactions, or at least executives speaking to the Duma as well. So those are areas of where the policies might be depersonalized. And also it's important to keep in mind, very briefly to note, that the relationships between Russia and personalized dictators may not be as cordial as they appear, and neither might they be as like sustainable or individually dependent. When Condé fell in Guinea, many people were concerned, the bauxite prices would go up, Russian leverage in Guinea would fall apart. They seamlessly have adapted to the new circumstances. Similarly, there were significant elements inside Russia who were skeptical of Sisi, who viewed him as a potential military dictator who might take Egyptian foreign policy back to the Mubarak era. That's been assuaged more recently, but that's always been there. Robert Mugabe certainly preferred the Chinese to the Russians because you remember the Soviet era backing of Joseph Nkomo. I mean, these relationships are not as perfect as they look. So that's why I think that the Chinese will probably be not that worried about those person-to-person autocracy promotion efforts, because in fact, the Russians are trying to support and prop up autocrats that China generally has a good and favorable relationship with. They recognize the fact that there's more behind the scenes in these relationships than the Western media might show, and also the Russian policy is a lot more adaptable and flexible. What the Chinese are more worried about is Russian Wagner Group activities on actors that are not representatives of UN-related governments, and residual relationships that Russia might have with rebel groups or with other groups that are trying to challenge the extra-legal turnover of power. I think that China is much more worried about Russia's residual relations with the ex-Seleka rebels in CAR, which it seemed to have ended over the past year and a half, but they were there, or Russia's relationship with Khalifa Haftar and where that might go, than the Russian relationships with autocrats and kleptocrats across the continent. That's kind of how I see that question.
Thank you, Sam. A question from Lerato Tsebe. This is for all the panelists that can answer. What should Russia's relations with Africa look like? And how do you think this is different from Africa's relations with Western countries? Maybe Khadija, you could start on that. If you're still there, you're muted. Khadija, are you still with us? Maybe I'll hand it over to Kaylee.
Sure. I don't know if I would answer a question on what Russia's relations with Africa should look like, but on how this relationship is different to its engagement with Western countries. We know that, for example, elite bonding has taken place between Russia and Africa over a common support for things like non-interference, support for African problems or African solutions to African problems, support for authoritarian stability. And we see these regular reminders of Soviet-era legacies. And I think that Russia almost plays on this, and so its soft power is really quite effective at the elite level. But we're also seeing Russia has resisted, multilateral sanctions on countries like Burundi, South Sudan. It certainly sought to water them down in the CAR. And by opposing these sanctions on African countries, it's showing support for the principle of non-interference. And I think that's something that appeals to leaders on this continent and is perhaps, different to the way that Africa relates to Western countries.
Vinka, I don't know if you want to come in.
Yes, I think the major challenge or the thing that needs to change in the Russia-Africa relationship is Russia itself. The way the government is built at the moment, the power structure is constructed, it assumes high levels of kickbacks from any interactions. And this set a number of limitations to relationship with African countries, because whatever relationship you want to establish, you have to ensure those kickbacks to Russian and sometimes to African politicians as well, which makes that relationship really difficult and heavy. If both countries could work rather on how to make governance more transparent, I guess both parties would benefit significantly, but this is impossible to change in the current Russian structure.
Thank you. I want to move on to just try to get through as many as possible. From Vyacheslav is another comment. Russia has forgiven African countries billions of dollars of debt. When we helped African countries to liberate in our country, then in the US, then the USSR, we had nothing often. You don't know that. And I stood in line for hours to buy bread. It seems to us that there could be more gratitude on and a more friendly attitude towards my country, some preferences, but alas, this is not the case. And the further, the less hope that it will be. Zdenka?
Yeah, so indeed, Russia forgiven a big amount of debt to African countries. What we should also understand that those debts to a large extent were inflated. So these were signed agreements between Soviet Union and, for example, Zambia and Tanzania, predominantly for military equipment. And as Vyacheslav Yakunin would understand, the prices in dollars for Russia at the time were quite a relative figure. When Russia decided to restructure the debt, they didn't restructure it to benefit the African countries. If you look at the comments of Russian officials who were involved in that restructuring, they were saying we can't otherwise receive any paybacks from this amount. So by restructuring the debt and forgiving a large amount, Russia was trying to receive some fundings for themselves to increase that payback. If we say that there is no gratitude, I would disagree, and I think a lot of Africans appreciate the Russian support during Soviet Union, and that's something where Russia differs from the cooperation with Western governments. There is a high level of understanding of the contribution in decolonization that the Soviet Union did. Unfortunately, I think current Russian government manipulates that feeling and also tries to use it in a way that might not necessarily benefit the African countries. Just as an example, we can talk about the nuclear deal in South Africa and close relationship between Zuma and Putin. On multiple occasions, Zuma would state how important he sees that support that Russia provided over the Soviet Union provided over multiple years, and the support for ANC in South Africa. But the payback that Zuma was providing was not transparent and not in the benefit of South African people.
Thank you. So Nompululelo is asking, what has Africa benefited from the Russian-Africa Summit in 2019? We often see grand pledges and promises of money and promises of things that, how much of it is actually changed? There's talk of the next summit, which is supposed to be in 2022, probably in Ethiopia and probably in October, November. But can any of the speakers point to tangible outcomes from the summit? Maybe Zdenka, since you have the floor, if it's something that you've looked at, if it's not something that you think you can answer, we can pass it on.
It's difficult to say what African countries really benefited, because maybe it's a little bit short period of time, as summit happened in 2019, and then with the pandemic we can't really talk about things as usual. So probably we can, if something does change, we would see it in the longer term. As one example that comes from Zambia and Tanzania, I can say that the agreement was signed to provide Zambia with aircraft, with jets, but because of difficult financial situation of Zambia, it did not materialize. So the aircrafts were not supplied. And this is not the only what happened after Russia-Africa summit. This is something that happens along the way of Russia relationship with Zambia and Tanzania. A number of MOU are signed, and some of them are quite exact. For example, the agreement was signed to supply to Tanzania MS aircrafts in 2016, but also didn't materialize. So the signing of agreements and large statements that do not necessarily mean that there will be the quick implementation. But on the other side, I think what has already changed, Russia and the African relationship definitely came forward, and a lot more thinking is happening around those collaborations, which might benefit both parties in the long run.
Sam, you look like you're ready to give an answer.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Zvinka was saying here. Yeah, the Sochi summit, we shouldn't be looking at it in the long run just yet, because obviously the COVID-19 pandemic created so many different X factors and possible outcomes. But just a few deals that did come to mind, and one trend that I just wanted to note was that when there were already discussions about a particular sectoral deal or a particular MOU in the 12 months leading up to the Sochi summit, there seems to be a little bit more follow through in the aftermath afterwards. So the Sochi summit, even though all the deals were signed there, even though it looks like the place where deals were made, it was kind of more of it should be focusing more on the symbolism of, we should be more focusing on how it kind of was a place where these things were consolidating existing trends rather than a place where new trends were formed. That's just one thing that we should clarify. A couple of areas where I could tangibly tie things back to the Sochi summit. Nigeria, it would be interesting. The sale of the 12 Mi-35 fighter jets, that was down on the 23rd. And then those jets have been moving towards Nigeria. That's one example of where that could come from. We also saw the Nigerian ambassador to Russia at the time basically say that we want Russian jets because we want to crush Boko Haram the same way the Russians crushed ISIS in Syria. So that's like, again, another layer of their authoritarian solidarity narratives and strong state approaches and anti-Western norms playing out in the context of an actual commercial deal. That's one important example, I think, that's relevant, and particularly with the August 2021 Russia-Nigeria military cooperation agreement and what that might lead to cooperation moving forward, that the relationship between Russia and Nigeria has now gone from just being a hedge against the United States to something that's a little bit more institutionalized in the security sphere. Another quick example of something that may have come forward as a result of what we saw during the Sochi summit would probably be, I think, the overall the Russian consolidation of the partnership with Ethiopia. I mean, that definitely benefited from it with regards to everything from military training to viewing Ethiopia as a target market for Russian investors. So that's something that I think changed as a result of the fact that Abiy Ahmed was feted there, and Russia also got inserted itself in the GERD dispute by kind of being a interlocutor between Abiy Ahmed and Sisi. So that was a new diplomatic role that Russia had, that and its role in favor of supporting an African Union solution there has strengthened that partnership with Ethiopia. Another commercial deal to watch, I think, is Alrosa and Alrosa Diamond. They've been doing some stuff, particularly with regards to Angola. I mean, Alrosa actually chaired a major panel at that summit. So the deals that were discussed in April of 2019, they were skeptical of Lourenco at first because Dos Santos had voted for the annexation of Crimea and Russian conduct in Ukraine. Lourenco went back on a more pro-Western position. Then Lourenco tried to smooth things over earlier in the year. And now it looks as if the diamonds from that deal are being pumped and are coming to fruition in late 2020 and through this year. So that's another example of something that happened. So those are a few things, but for the most part, it's exactly as Zvinka said. It's a lot of large promises, and it's really too hard to test because of what we've seen over the past year and a half across the world.
Thank you. There's a question from Oleg Kvasiuk, who says, what do you think Russia's next step towards Africa should be, and should African countries change their attitudes or policies? It seems that Russia intends to continue to use hybrid warfare, such as the use of the Wagner Group in Africa. John, maybe you have some comments on that, and any final statements, and then I think we're going to wrap after that.
I think I'll go back to one of the responses that was given by the previous speakers. I mean, that very much depends on developments within Russia itself, and we see similar contradictions with the relationship between Africa and China, with the democratic aspirations of Africans across the continent. You can see China and also countries like Russia bumping up against some of these developments that have become institutionalized in our society, especially over the last 30 years. So, if I was to say anything, it's just, it is slightly perturbing where the support that is given to some of the most illegitimate leaders on the continent sometimes deepens crises in parts of Africa. Whereas if you look across the continent to a young population, majority of the population, if you look at the kind of work that is done by Afrobarometer, are supportive of democratic processes, have become used to having their mobile phones, being able to communicate with each other, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and those are freedoms that need to be guarded very jealously in all our relationships with these big powers. Now, Africa is we are poor, but our relationships with all these powers are always fraught, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, whether it's France, whether it's America. These are always difficult relationships, and it's to acknowledge that and to deal with that accordingly.
I think that's a very fine note to conclude on. I'm not going to give everybody a chance to respond. I think you've had an opportunity in the questions. Just to say a very big thank you to our funders of this work, including the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and the Swedish government, which has strongly supported SAI's work over many, many years, and a third funder who wishes to remain anonymous. Thank you very much to our panel who've joined us from Kenya, from Stellenbosch, from Hillcrest, and from Johannesburg. I think that's covered everybody, and of course from Oxford. I think we all complain about how our lives have been disrupted by COVID, but I think this is probably something we would never have conceptualized 2 years ago. The fact that we can all be in the same virtual room. Also, a big thank you to Kaylee for putting it together. Thank you, and for really driving the project forward, which is fantastic. This is going to serve as a teaser for the papers that will hopefully be out in the next couple of months, hopefully before the new year, but we will be in communication with you. And we look forward to holding more of these sorts of events in the future. Also, a big thank you to our events department, Dumi and Sarasa, and of course, Biwe and Nikki from our communications department, and Alex and her team from our publications department. None of the show would be going on without you. I'm glad we survived the storm. It was a big one in Joburg, wherever you may be in the world joining us. Thank you very, very much. There have been some requests for the presentations. So I think those will be coordinated by Kaylee, and we'll put them on our website probably within the next day or two. Thank you, everybody, and have a very pleasant evening further. We're done. Thank you.
Thank you.